Welcome back to another episode of Flawless Plan Garage, where today we are once again working on my 1994 Buick Roadmaster station wagon, into which I am attempting to cram a 6.6 liter LB7 Duramax diesel and Allison transmission. This is the heavily modified chassis. As you have seen recently, we've done a lot of work to make things fit in the chassis. But next, in order to handle the 800 plus foot-pounds of torque I intend to make out of that motor, we are upgrading the GM 10-bolt stock rear axle to a beefy aftermarket Ford 9-inch. But before we do, today's video is sponsored by male pattern baldness. Do you know that most men will eventually lose some hair? I know I am. I'm living with it. Shouldn't you? Stay tuned. Okay, so the flawless plan for the axle is take it out, which shouldn't be too tough, then cut the brackets off in a way that keeps them salvageable, so that I can use the same brackets to mount the springs, because I'll be using the same springs, and the 4-link bars and the shocks, because that's kind of a big complicated mount. I want to just keep that the same, but I'll be making new 4-link bars, and I will have to make new 4-link mount brackets for the top tabs once I get that in. Out it comes. So most of the bracketry I've been able to get moved over through, extensive measuring and coming up with different ways to kind of make sure that everything's in the right spot, at the right angle, level, etc. That's gone fairly well, fairly straightforward, no big issues there. For what it's worth, I also learned that GM was not super precise in their locations of these brackets. My side-to-side measurements were not exactly the same, off by 1/8 of an inch or more in some cases. So I feel pretty good about my ability to replicate that level of precision. But when it comes to these guys here, making sure I get the upper mounts for the parallel 4-link, these triangulated mounts, I need to find a way to get these in the right spot. And there's just not, from what I can tell, an easy way to measure exactly where these mounts are supposed to be. I don't have like a good reference point exactly. So I think I'm going to make like a negative jig to locate where these mounts are supposed to end up. Okay, here's the plan for my negative jig. I have taken some old exhaust tubing, cut it in half, marked the center line that is lined up here with the center line of the old axle. Then I've made a couple of simple little plates with holes in them that are bolted through. I'm going to weld this little scrap of tubing on top, join those together. Then I've got a few little miscellaneous pieces of plate that I've cut out, and I'm just going to weld these up as braces in various locations here to hold it all together. Then I can unbolt it, lift the whole thing off, and I'll have my negative jig that tells me where the new plates need to be, in theory. Okay, here's a pro tip for you. Before you make your negative jig, make sure that the width of the new center section for the new housing is not so much wider than the old one that your negative jig doesn't fit between the tubes. And I kind of thought that like these might be too deep, but they may not be. This, however, is a problem. I don't think I can make that work. Like cutting that narrower is not gonna help. I don't have enough room for that. So I think we're cutting this whole thing off and trying it again. Okay, next attempt. After quite a bit of nasty booger welding, I think we're actually fitting on here now. I've marked the center line of the axle, and then I have my little stamped marks for the center of the jig. Looks like it lines up all right. Now I just need to make sure I get it centered this way, and then I will have my negative jig to start making some mounts. Well, it's an axle. I'm not sure if it fits, but there's no questioning the strength of those tack welds after wailing on them with a sledgehammer for a little bit there. Now to fiddle with it and see if it actually has the brackets in the right spot and if I feel like I can get the movement that I need through the suspension travel range. Springs still fit just like stock, and I can't do it one-handed, but the shocks still fit just like stock too. Same mounts, top and bottom. On today's episode of Measure Twice, Order Parts Once, when I carefully removed and measured these bolts for these upper control arms, they were, M12s, so a 1/2 inch through hole in the new end links was the right size. Get those bolts through there, worked out great. And I assumed that, golly gee whiz, if it's an M12 bolt going through this end of the arm, surely the other end of the arm back on the chassis must also be an M12 bolt, right? Right? Wrong. This is an M14 bolt on the other side of that same arm. So, M14 bolt fits in that hole. M12, pretty sloppy. And that also is what's used on the lower control arm and on the inner mounts for the lower control arm. M14's on both sides. So all of my, end link pieces that I bought are all technically a little small. Although, I could use an M12 bolt through these and then just with a little bushing to go through the holes that are in the body. So it's usable. I can still do it, and there's no, going to be no meaningful strength or slop issues. I can deal with that. But the other thing is Barnes 4x4, nice quality stuff, and the prices were reasonable given what the stuff is. But I ordered 4 left-hand thread and 4 right-hand thread, and they sent me 5 left-hand thread and 3 right-hand thread. So I'll need to get a hold of them, but I already cannot make all my arms right now. And I'm starting to think that maybe I'll have enough adjustability in the top, the upper arms here, that maybe I could reuse the stock lower arms and just box them in. Thinking seriously, maybe just about plating the bottom of these, and then I've replaced these bushings because these are in pretty poor shape. But I'm thinking seriously about that because, this thing boxed in ought to be strong enough to do what needs to be done. And I might not need the adjustability. And hey, extra rubber in the suspension versus what I'm going to end up with these poly links can only, keep me closer to that original ride quality in the back. So, I don't know. Thinking pretty seriously about that. it's pretty obvious by this point that the axle is not fitting, which in and of itself is not a big surprise because these are cut to fit axles. So that's probably why it's not actually seating all the way down into its location, right? Because it's too long. Well, that's a problem easily fixed. Time to cut the axles. Okay, time for a little, mocking up, figuring out how things go together. We've got these little T-bolts that are going to retain the axles. And once again, my planning works out beautifully because the bolt won't go in because of the bump stop bracket that I have welded onto the axle. Yeah, this is how my projects usually go. In this case, I don't think it'll be too bad. I'll ream the hole out just a tiny, tiny bit just to give me enough room to slide that in. Should be fine. Okay, in just a couple seconds with the drill. Voila. Okay, in the never-ending story of things that don't fit, check out this inner race inside this fancy new axle. This is not an accurate measurement of it, but it's approximately this wide, these calipers. Now check out this like bearing retainer, spacer, whatever this thing is on the axle. And check out, oh look, that's not a similar diameter at all. I wonder why the axle doesn't fit. Yeah. So credit to Speedway and to Barnes 4-wheel drive for good customer service in both cases. Barnes, I just dropped him an email with a picture and explained that I had 5 lefts and 3 rights. And I mean, like 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, had a reply that, an apology and that they were sending out the correct joint in the mail that day. Got it a few days later. So thanks, guys. I appreciate that. And then Speedway, those axles were originally back ordered. So I had to wait a while to get them. Then, one of them was wrong. It was 28 spline instead of 31 spline in a 31 spline box. They took care of that. Also, both of them had the wrong bearing retaining collar. It was the wrong size. And I just mentioned that to them. They said, "Oh man, we're sorry. We're right, or you're right. We know we had a run of those with bad collar sizes. We're getting some new ones in. We'll replace those." And I had already cut one of the axles. So I said, "Man, I appreciate that, but I've already cut one of these. I'm sure you don't want it back." He said, No, it's our mistake. We'll take it back." So credit to those guys for getting me a couple new axles. So I've got those right here, and I'm gonna do some cutting. And in today's installment of things that don't fit, we have these axles. So the axle has a spec they call the offset. It's basically how much the axle, once it is fully seated into the housing here with the bearing, it's how much the face of the axle and the hub back behind there sticks out. And the spec on this axle is supposed to be exactly 2.5 inches. The brake kit, this custom kind of aftermarket Ford 9-inch rear disc brake kit, is also set up for a 2.5-inch axle offset. However, these axles are actually just a fuzz over 2 5/8 inches of offset. So they're a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch further out than they should be. So it's taken quite a bit of fiddling. I have this temporarily set up with just washers here. What I've had to do, this is supposed to have a much larger spacer installed here to locate this bracket that the caliper mounts to. Instead, I've had to basically run this as far in as I possibly can. And it's probably really difficult to see here, but the axle flange itself dictates how far this way to the outside I can mount this bracket. So I'm basically right up against the axle flange based on this amount of spacer or washer. But I have the clearance I need there. I have the clearance I need for the brakes to be able to turn. The pads are not jammed in there tight. It's got a little bit of room on the slide pin yet, so it should work. Should do what it needs to do at this depth, so that's good. I also cannot mount this bracket or this caliper in the normal location. The normal location would actually be up here because of the clearance issues with the frame. By moving it down, I gain quite a bit of frame clearance, but of course that clearance costs me something, and that is clearance for the parking brake cable. So the brake hose up here I think will be fine. It's not bound up tight. We'll be able to mount this here and get the hard brake lines made. So there I think we're fine. But this bracket where the parking brake cable comes in ends up being in the same spot as the actual trailing arm or lower forelink arm. I don't know if you can see that there, but like the cable needs to be in the same place as the bracket. So I think I'm going to end up having to remake this bracket, try to shorten it as long as I can still get enough movement from the arm for the parking brake for that to actually articulate and move properly. I'll try to shorten this bracket so I can route the cable around and behind my lower forelink bar and mount. Always something. I have so few good ideas on this channel that I felt like this one was worthy of mentioning. So, this e-brake spring, it's pretty annoying to try to like compress it and pull it out because it's under quite a bit of tension. How about a zip tie down one side just to keep the worm clamp from sliding out? Then, run the clamp, give it a little squeeze, just enough to take the most of the tension off of it. Way easier. Okay, I'm fairly certain this will work. So this lever has been notched. So instead of only going to about here for full retraction, now the full retraction is back here, which should also allow me then to move this bracket surface, this way. And previously, the distance here was about 3¼ inches, and now it's about 4¼ So that should mean that I can move this surface by 1 inch or thereabouts and still have the same amount of travel in the parking brake. And I think from looking at this distance and making sure I still have clearance to get to the caliper pin in here, I think 1 inch or thereabouts is probably about all the more I can move it, maybe 1 1/8 inches, something like that. So time to start chopping this one up and welding it back together. All right, so you can see here the before and the after. And you can see that this lever, now that it's been notched, is able to have a significantly further this way starting position, and that the bracket here is relative to the position of the caliper is pretty significantly back this way. So I'm pretty confident this will work. Got about the same retracted depth here, so we ought to have about the same amount of throw available. We're gonna bolt this up, double check some clearances on the car, and if it looks okay, start making the same mods to this other one. And obviously, in a piece of news that should surprise you not at all, it's not gonna fit. So just an angle issue. You can see even with my bracket cut away a little bit here for some clearance, the angle that this is trying to exit is just not going to work. Like the ferrule is on this cable is going to run right into the bracket here. Even if I try to cut that away, it's just going to end up hitting the lower pivot here. So we're going to cut the bracket again and angle it away to help shoot the cable kind of between the, what would be the backing plate, but isn't in this case, and the lower control arm, or the outside of the bracket where the lower control arm attaches. Okay, well, here's more reasons why you shouldn't build custom vehicles. So, more lack of flawless planning over here. Not only do these brakes not actually fit on the axles, which we're still working on trying to get the right axles for this setup, but if we assume that I did get axles that would fit, the disc brake, if mounted here, like if the caliper's mounted here, which is about the closest I can get to the intended, one of the intended angles for it, it smacks right into the frame. if I get close to full compression on the rear suspension. The bump stop normally would go here. It's about this tall, so this would be pretty close to full compression. But, you know, it's going to happen, especially even with airbags, especially towing and going over big bumps, car full of kids, etc. So I've got to decide what I'm going to do here. Either I'm going to have to really rethink and re-engineer a bunch of the braking system back here, or think about maybe scalloping out the frame right here, give myself a little bit more clearance for the hose and you know, a little bit of the caliper body. At the moment, I'm kind of leaning that way. I think I could, you know, cut that, plate that, give myself some more room underneath without compromising strength and gaining a bit of dimension where I need it. There's strength on the backside of this too. This is a relatively strong portion in terms of the way it's jointed, plus I've got my upper reinforcements on it already. Ain't nothing easy. It's at this point that many of you should be asking, wouldn't it have been easier and simpler to just widen the axle back to the original dimensions rather than having to do all the other modifications to make the too narrow axle fit? To which I can only respond, yes. Yes, that would have been easier. And that is an axle. So I've slapped on some Corvair wheels that are 13 inches and have some really ancient, these are at least 20 years old and have been sitting dry rotting outside for most of that time. Tires on there, obviously wildly the wrong size, but I just want to be able to roll it. And I didn't have much else that was on a 5 on 4 3/4 bolt pattern that I could slap on here. Now you'll notice I bolted these on backwards. This axle being so much narrower means that you know, I'm going to need a very, very different offset. You'll see at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, what wheels I have in mind here, but it is going to be a fairly deep dish in the back, even though the wheels themselves will not be anything too crazy or extreme. I've had to remove the brakes temporarily because 13-inch wheels don't clear the calipers, but my little notch in the frame on each side is done, welded up, and so the calipers do actually clear into the frame. And the axle is pretty much mounted. The spring perches, you can see here, I took the stock spring perches and moved them over to the new axle so that I could use the stock springs, which have a very small base diameter. Those spring perches were at, you know, kind of an odd angle, even on the old axle. And so it looks a little funky being installed here, but we'll see how that looks once I get the pinion angle set up. And worst case, I might have to cut those off and weld them on again to make sure that they're at an okay angle. But overall, the axle is in. I still have brakes to sort out, brake lines, and the parking brake cables to actually route and get some little brackets mounted. But otherwise, the axle's in, which means I can work on getting the chassis on the ground again, being able to roll it around, paint it, finish it up, and you know, start working on pinion angles and my transmission mount that remains to be constructed yet. So that's it for today. We now have a beefy Ford 9-inch fabricated axle installed in the back of the wagon, which hopefully will put up with the ridiculous amount of torque to come. But to find out, both for you and for me, you'll have to tune in next time. Thanks for watching.